Today let me tell you a story you won't forget. Out here in the wild, you see things that change you. You witness nature at its rawest, its beauty, its cruelty, its unforgiving rules. But every now and then, something happens that defies those rules. Something that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Years ago, in the middle of a raging storm, a man named Daniel Carter made a choice. He could have walked away, could have ignored the tiny, helpless creature fighting for its life against a pack of hungry wolves. But he didn't. He raised his rifle, he stepped forward, and in that moment, he set something into motion, something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Because that wasn't just any creature. And what Daniel didn't know that night was that saving it would change his life forever. And years later, when he found himself staring death in the face, when the wolves came for him instead, he froze. Because what stood before him wasn't just a tiger. It was him. What do you think happened next? Let me know in the comments, and tell me, where are you watching this video from? Also, if you love stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The night was unforgiving. The thick canopy of trees swayed violently as a storm raged above the vast wilderness. Rain poured in torrents, drenching everything in its path. The wind howled through the towering pines, rattling the branches and carrying the distant cries of nocturnal predators. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, echoing across the valley like the growl of an ancient beast. Daniel Carter pulled his coat tighter around his broad frame, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. His cabin was miles away, and the unexpected storm had forced him to take shelter beneath a rocky overhang earlier in the evening. Now that the worst of the lightning had passed, he was making his way back, carefully, cautiously, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Daniel had lived in these mountains for years, learning their secrets, respecting their dangers. Once a soldier, then a wilderness guide, he had chosen this life of solitude. The forest was his sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world faded into the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a lone wolf. But something about this night felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unease that prickled at the back of his neck. Then he heard it, a sharp, desperate cry, high-pitched and terrified. Daniel stopped in his tracks, every muscle in his body tensing. Over the years, he had learned the sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the warning barks of a fox, the guttural growls of a bear. But this sound was different. It was small, helpless, and it was in trouble. Carefully, he moved toward the noise, stepping lightly to avoid snapping twigs. The downpour made it difficult to see, but as he approached the source of the sound, his sharp eyes caught movement in the darkness. A small clearing lay ahead, the ground slick with mud and scattered with leaves. In the dim light of the stormy night, he saw them, 4 wolves, their fur bristling, their bodies low to the ground as they circled something. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing. Wolves were dangerous, especially in numbers, but he wasn't their target. The real target was lying in the center of the circle, a tiny creature, barely larger than a housecat, cowered in the mud. Even from a distance, Daniel recognized its unmistakable markings, the faint black stripes running down its golden-orange fur, the rounded ears, the tiny tail curled in fear. A tiger cub. Daniel's heart clenched. A cub this young shouldn't be alone. Its mother was either dead or too far away to protect it. And now, the wolves, opportunistic and merciless, were ready to claim their prize. The cub let out another weak cry, baring its minuscule teeth in a feeble attempt to defend itself. One of the wolves lunged forward, snapping at its side, but it wasn't a killing bite. They were toying with it, wearing it down, waiting for the perfect moment. Daniel knew the logical thing to do was to turn away. This was the way of the wild, nature's brutal, unflinching reality. The wolves were only following their instincts, just as the cub's mother had when she abandoned it or was killed. But he couldn't look away. His grip tightened around the rifle. With a sharp inhale, he raised the weapon and fired a warning shot into the air. The explosion cracked through the forest like a lightning strike. Instantly, the wolves jerked back, their eyes flashing with surprise and fear. They hesitated for only a second before bolting into the darkness, their sleek forms vanishing between the trees. Then, silence. Daniel lowered his rifle and stepped forward cautiously. his boots squelching in the mud. The cub lay motionless, its frail body trembling violently from cold and terror. Up close, he could see the damage, tiny scratches on its side where the wolves had nipped. Its fur soaked and matted from the rain. It was breathing fast, its little chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. But what struck Daniel the most were its eyes. Even in the dim moonlight, they glowed a mesmerizing shade of amber. Wide with fear but also something else, something that almost looked like recognition. "Damn it," Daniel muttered under his breath. He hesitated. He knew what this meant. If he took the cub, he would be interfering. He would be responsible. He had no idea how to care for a tiger, and the thought of nursing a wild predator back to health seemed absurd. But he also knew what would happen if he left it behind. With a deep sigh, Daniel pulled off his coat and wrapped it around the cub's fragile body. It let out a weak whimper but didn't resist. He could feel its tiny heartbeat, erratic and rapid against his palm. "You're one lucky little thing," he murmured, adjusting his grip to cradle the cub securely against his chest. Then, without another word, he turned and began the long journey back to his cabin, unaware that this small act of compassion would change his life forever. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Daniel reached his cabin. But the cold remained, biting through his damp clothes. He pushed open the heavy wooden door with his shoulder, stepping into the warm, dimly lit interior. The cabin was small but sturdy, built to withstand the unforgiving mountain weather. A stone fireplace crackled with low burning embers, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Daniel shut the door behind him, locking out the storm and the dangers of the night. He moved swiftly, his instincts honed by years of survival. He needed to get the cub warm and dry, fast. Gently, he laid the tiny creature on an old wool blanket near the fireplace. The cub whimpered softly, curling in on itself as shivers racked its frail body. Its fur was still wet, matted with mud and streaked with scratches from the wolves' attack. Daniel crouched beside it, grabbing a clean towel from a wooden chest nearby. Carefully, he began to rub the cub dry, his movements slow and deliberate. The little tiger flinched at first, its body tense with fear, but as the warmth of the fire seeped into its tiny frame, it gradually relaxed. "You're a stubborn little thing," Daniel murmured, shaking his head. As the minutes passed, the cub's shivering lessened, and its breathing steadied. For the first time, it opened its mouth slightly and let out a tiny, exhausted sigh. Daniel sat back, watching it closely. He had no idea what to feed a tiger cub. He had spent years tracking predators, studying their behavior in the wild, but he had never imagined he'd be responsible for raising one. "Milk," he muttered to himself. "You'll need milk." He stood and moved toward the kitchen, searching through his supplies. He had some powdered milk meant for emergencies. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He mixed it with warm water, then grabbed a clean cloth, improvising a feeding method. Kneeling beside the cub again, he gently lifted its head. "Come on, kid," he whispered. "Drink." The cub hesitated, its amber eyes staring up at him, wary and uncertain. But then, instinct took over. Its tiny mouth latched onto the soaked cloth, suckling weakly at first, then more desperately. Daniel exhaled, relieved. "Good, that's it." For the next few hours, he watched over the cub, making sure it stayed warm and fed. He dressed the small scratches with disinfectant, though the cub whined in protest. Even in its weakened state, it had spirit. As the storm outside finally faded into the quiet hush of the forest, Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, staring at the creature he had just rescued. He hadn't planned on this. His life was simple, just him and the wilderness. He wasn't a caretaker. He wasn't a father. The storm had long passed, leaving behind a fresh, damp scent in the air as the sun rose over the wilderness. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and the towering pines swayed gently in the morning breeze. Inside his cabin, Daniel Carter sat on the wooden floor beside the fireplace, staring at the small tiger cub curled up in a wool blanket. It had been 2 days since he had rescued the cub from the wolves. At first, the tiny creature had been weak and barely able to lift its head. But now, after being fed warm milk and kept safe inside the cabin, it was beginning to show signs of strength. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his unshaven face. He had spent his entire life living by the rules of the wild, understanding that nature had its own balance, its own laws, and yet, here he was, going against them by keeping a predator in his home. The cub let out a small yawn, blinking its bright amber eyes before gazing up at Daniel. There was something in its look, something that made it harder for Daniel to stay detached. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, but the cub didn't understand. It simply stretched its tiny paws and, to Daniel's surprise, clumsily stumbled toward him, pressing its small body against his leg. Daniel felt an unexpected pang in his chest. He wasn't a caretaker. He wasn't someone who raised animals. And yet, the cub had somehow decided he was safe. Still, he knew the truth. The longer the cub stayed here, the harder it would be for both of them. It belonged in the wild. And so, Daniel made his decision. The next morning, Daniel prepared to return the cub to where it belonged. He packed a small bag with supplies, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and carefully wrapped the cub in his coat before stepping out of the cabin. The forest was alive with the sounds of morning, birds fluttering in the treetops, the rustle of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. The ground was still damp from the storm, and Daniel could see fresh tracks in the mud, paw prints belonging to something much larger than a wolf. It was a sign. The mother tiger might still be out there, searching for her lost cub. With careful steps, he followed the same route he had taken the night of the storm. Retracing his path back to where he had found the cub, he moved slowly, scanning for signs of a den, any indication that the cub might have wandered away from its home. The cub, cradled against his chest, let out a soft, inquisitive noise as if recognizing its surroundings. Its tiny ears perked up, and for the first time since Daniel had found it, it didn't look scared. That was a good sign. After an hour of searching, Daniel finally found it, a cave, nestled between the rocks at the base of a hill, partially hidden by dense foliage. The entrance was wide, and around it, he could see deep claw marks in the bark of nearby trees. There were also tracks, large ones. Daniel's grip on the cub tightened slightly. There was no doubt about it. This was the home of a tiger. His heartbeat quickened. If the mother was inside, she would not take kindly to him standing near her den. But if she wasn't here, then he had to make sure the cub found its way back safely. He knelt down and gently placed the cub on the ground. The cub hesitated, sniffing the air, its little body trembling slightly. Then, instinct kicked in. It took a few cautious steps forward, its ears twitching as it listened. Daniel held his breath. Then, from the darkness of the cave, a sound echoed, a deep, low growl. Daniel's muscles tensed. His hand instinctively moved toward his rifle. But he didn't raise it. This wasn't a fight. He was only here to return what belonged to the wild. The growl grew softer, then turned into something else, a chuffing sound. The cub let out a small chirping noise in response. Then, from the shadows of the cave, a massive form emerged, a tigress. She was enormous, her golden-orange fur gleaming in the morning light. Her sharp eyes locked onto Daniel. But she didn't attack. She only stood there, watching. The cub let out another chirp and stumbled forward. The mother tiger lowered her head, sniffing the cub, nudging it with her nose as if confirming that it was really there. Then, in one swift motion, she picked it up by the scruff of its neck and turned back into the cave. Daniel exhaled, his body finally relaxing. He had done the right thing. As the mother disappeared into the darkness, Daniel took a slow step back. Then another. He knew better than to overstay his welcome. But just before he turned to leave, the tigress reappeared at the entrance of the cave. For a moment, she simply stood there, looking at him. Then, to his astonishment, she let out a slow, deep chuff, the same sound she had made for her cub. A gesture of acknowledgement. Daniel felt a strange sensation in his chest. He gave a small nod before finally turning away, disappearing into the trees. As he walked back toward his cabin, he couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the last time he would see that cub. Not by a long shot. It was a crisp autumn morning when Daniel ventured deeper into the forest. Farther than he had gone in years. The air was cool, and the trees were beginning to shed their leaves, creating a golden path beneath his boots. He was tracking a deer, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His senses sharp. The forest was silent, too silent. Daniel Carter had spent enough years in the wilderness to know when something wasn't right. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, the distant howls, had faded into an eerie stillness. The kind that only meant one thing. Something was watching him. Daniel adjusted his rifle strap, his boots pressing into the damp earth as he moved carefully through the trees. He had been tracking a deer, following its hoofprints through the mud, but now his instincts screamed at him to stop. Then he heard it, a low growl, then another. He turned sharply, and his breath caught in his throat. Wolves, not just one or two, but an entire pack, at least 6 of them, standing in a loose semicircle around him. Their eyes glowed in the dim light, their lean, muscular bodies tensed and ready to strike. Daniel's grip tightened on his knife. He had faced wolves before, but never this many at once. His rifle was strapped to his back, but there was no time to reach for it. The leader of the pack, a massive black-furred wolf with scars across its muzzle, took a step forward, lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. The rest followed, inching closer, their breath visible in the cold air. Daniel knew what this was. He had unknowingly stepped into their hunting grounds, and now he was the prey. His pulse pounded. He had to act fast. Slowly, he reached for his knife, keeping his movements controlled. The moment he made a wrong move, they would pounce. Then, the leader snarled and lunged. Daniel barely had time to react. He sidestepped, slashing out with his knife. But the wolf was faster. Its powerful body crashed into him, knocking him off balance. He hit the ground hard, his knife slipping from his grip. Pain shot through his ribs, but he had no time to dwell on it. Another wolf snapped at his leg, and he kicked out, barely managing to push it away. This was it. The wolves would overwhelm him. He braced himself, and then, the forest erupted with a sound so deep, so powerful, that the very ground seemed to tremble. A roar, not a wolf's howl, not a bear's growl, a tiger's roar. Before Daniel could process what was happening, something massive crashed through the undergrowth. A blur of orange and black, a force of pure power and speed. The wolves yelped in alarm, but they were too slow. The first wolf barely had time to turn before a massive set of claws slashed across its side, sending it tumbling through the dirt with a pained whimper. The black-furred leader turned to fight, snarling, but the tiger was already on it. With a terrifying speed, the beast slammed into the wolf, knocking it off its feet. The wolf snapped at the tiger's throat, but the tiger was faster, stronger. With a single bite, it clamped down on the wolf's neck and threw it aside like a ragdoll. The remaining wolves hesitated. They had been the hunters, but now they were the hunted. A deep, rumbling growl filled the air as the tiger turned its piercing amber eyes on the pack. Recognition hit Daniel like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't just any tiger. It was him, Stryker, the cub Daniel had once saved, now fully grown into a massive predator, standing before him like a guardian of the wild. The wolves, sensing they were outmatched, whimpered and began retreating into the forest. The leader, still dazed from the blow, limped after them. Within seconds, they were gone. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't eerie. It was something else, something sacred. Daniel lay on the ground, staring up at the massive tiger that had just saved his life. Stryker stood tall, his powerful body blocking out the fading light of the setting sun. His fur gleamed, his muscles rippled with every slow, calculated movement, but it was his eyes that held Daniel in place. The same amber eyes from all those years ago. Stryker took a step forward, lowering his head slightly. Daniel tensed but didn't move. He knew better than to show fear. Then, in a moment that defied everything he knew about the wild, the tiger did something extraordinary. He chuffed, a deep, breathy sound, a sound of recognition, of familiarity. Daniel let out a slow breath, pushing himself up onto his elbows. His body ached, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the tiger. "You remember me, don't you?" he whispered. Stryker let out another chuff. Daniel's chest tightened. He had spent years wondering what had become of the cub he had saved. He had feared that he had interfered too much, that the tiger would not survive in the wild. But here he was, alive, thriving, and, against all odds, still watching over him. Daniel reached out, slowly, Hesitantly, Stryker didn't flinch. For the second time in their lives, Daniel's fingers brushed against the tiger's fur. It was real. The moment lasted only a few seconds before Stryker pulled back, turning his massive head toward the forest. His job was done. The wolves were gone. The danger had passed. Without another sound, the tiger turned, his massive body disappearing into the undergrowth as silently as he had arrived. Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the spot where Stryker had stood. A small, disbelieving smile formed on his lips. "You really are something else, kid," he muttered. He didn't know when, or if, he would see Stryker again. But deep down, he knew one thing for certain. The cub he had once saved had never truly left him. And when the time came, Stryker had returned the favor. Days passed, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. But then he noticed the tracks near his cabin, the faint rustling in the trees when he was out hunting. One evening, he set out, moving silently through the forest, tracking the presence he suspected was there. And then, he saw it, a massive shadow, moving just beyond his sight, always keeping its distance. A slow smile formed on Daniel's lips. "You're still here, aren't you?" he murmured. A deep chuff answered from the darkness. Daniel chuckled and turned back toward his cabin, feeling a strange sense of comfort. Stryker had returned, not out of obligation, not as a wild beast stalking its prey, but as a guardian. A silent protector. The cub he had once saved had never truly left him. And Daniel knew, no matter where life took them, they would always be connected. What do you think about today's story? Do you believe situations like this can happen in real life? If you have any thoughts or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any exciting stories. See you in the next video.